Here is a war that killed more people than the First World War. Some estimates put the dead at 20 million, others at 30 million or more. By almost any measure, it was one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history. It was fought in China in the middle of the 19th century, at the very same time as the American Civil War on the other side of the world. But where the American Civil War killed perhaps 750,000 people, this war killed that many and then that many again, dozens of times over. Whole provinces were emptied. Great cities were reduced to silence. And yet, outside of China, most people have never even heard its name. It is called the Taiping Rebellion. How does something this enormous vanish from the world's memory? And stranger still, how did it begin? Because this apocalypse of a war, this conflict that swallowed a generation, did not start with an empire or an invasion. It started with a single man. A poor village schoolteacher who failed the same examination 4 times, fell into a fever, and woke believing he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This is the story of how one man's vision became a kingdom, and how that kingdom became a grave for tens of millions of people. To understand how it began, you have to understand a dream that shaped every ambitious life in imperial China: the examinations. In the China of the Qing dynasty, the surest path out of poverty and into power ran through a series of brutally difficult civil service examinations. Pass them, and you could become a scholar official, respected, secure, wealthy, lifting your entire family with you. The competition was ferocious, and the vast majority failed. These exams were a trial by endurance. Candidates were locked into tiny cells for days at a time, writing essays on the Confucian classics from memory, and only a tiny fraction ever passed the higher levels. For a poor young man, it was the one narrow door to a better life. And for Hong, it stayed shut. One of those who tried was a bright young man named Hong Xiuquan. He came from a poor Hakka family in the south, a member of a minority group often looked down upon. He was clever, and his village pinned its hopes on him. And again he traveled to the city, sat the great examination, and failed. After his third failure in 1837, something in him gave way. He collapsed into a severe illness, a fever that lasted for days. And in that fever, he had a series of vivid, shattering dreams. He dreamed he was carried up into the heavens. He saw a solemn old man with a golden beard who gave him a sword and told him to sweep the world clean of demons. And he saw a middle-aged man he came to think of as an elder brother who guided him. At the time, he did not know what the dreams meant. He recovered, went home, and, remarkably, sat the examination one more time. He failed again. But the dream did not leave him, and a few years later, a small book would give it a meaning that would set fire to an empire. Some years earlier, on one of his trips to the examination city, Hong had been handed a set of Christian pamphlets by missionaries and had barely glanced at them. Now, after his failures and his fever, he went back and read them carefully. And as he read, he believed he understood everything. The tracts spoke of one true God, of that God's Son, Jesus, and of a world in the grip of demons and false idols. To Hong, it all fit his vision with a perfect and dreadful clarity. The old man with the golden beard, he decided, had been God himself. The elder brother who guided him had been Jesus, and that made Hong, by his own reading, the second Son of God, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth with a divine mission: to destroy the demons and build God's kingdom in China. This was not Christianity as any missionary would have recognized it. Western churchmen who later encountered the movement were often disturbed by it. It was something new, a Chinese faith built out of a fevered vision and a handful of pamphlets. But to Hong, and soon to many thousands of others, it was simply the truth. He began to preach. He smashed the statues of the traditional gods and the tablets of Confucius. And with a few devoted companions, he founded a new religious community, the God-worshipping society, out among the poor villages of the South. Much of the work of spreading the new faith fell to a devoted friend, Feng Yunshan, who carried Hong's teachings into the remote hills of Guangxi province and slowly built a congregation there. By the time Hong himself arrived, thousands of the poor and the outcast had already gathered under the banner of the one true God. What began as a strange new faith was about to collide with a dying empire. And when it did, it would become an army. The China that Hong preached in was a land full of grievance. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for 2 centuries, was faltering. Its rulers were Manchus, an ethnic minority who governed the vast Han Chinese majority, and after generations of decline, resentment against them ran deep. The empire had just been humiliated by European powers in the Opium Wars, forced to open its ports and swallow the opium trade. Corruption was everywhere, harvests were failing, and in the crowded south, poverty and ethnic tension between groups like Hong's Hakka and their neighbors were boiling over. Into all of this, Hong's message dropped like a spark. He offered the poor and the desperate not only a God, but a purpose and a promise. Sweep away the corrupt Manchu demons and build a new heaven on earth, a kingdom of shared wealth and righteousness where the last would be first. The God-worshippers grew from a religious sect into a mass movement, tens of thousands strong. The authorities moved to crush them. The God-worshippers fought back, and in 1851, Hong Xiuquan formally declared the founding of a new state, the Taiping Rebellion, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, with himself as its heavenly king. The uprising itself had broken out weeks earlier at a place called Jinqian in the first days of 1851, on Hong's own birthday, where the cornered God-worshippers had risen in open revolt. It was the point of no return. A failed scholar had crowned himself a king, and now his followers would have to make his kingdom real, with fire and sword. What followed astonished everyone, including the Qing. The Taiping armies, burning with faith and discipline, swept out of the southern hills and began to march north. They were not a rabble, they were organized, motivated, and, at first, remarkably strict. Their ranks swelled as they went, drawing in the poor, the angry, and the hopeful by the hundreds of thousands. Whole populations joined them, or fell before them. The Taiping were unmistakable. In defiance of the Qing, whose subjects were forced to shave their foreheads and wear a long braided queue, the Taiping let all their hair grow long, and the Qing came to call them simply the long-haired rebels. They marched in disciplined columns, men and women in separate ranks, singing hymns as they advanced. In 1853, they reached Nanjing, one of the greatest cities in China, and took it. Hong made it his capital, renaming it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. From here, the heavenly kingdom would rule. At their height, the Taiping controlled a vast swath of the richest and most populous part of China, the lands along the Yangtze River, with tens of millions of people under their authority. For a time, it genuinely looked as though the Qing dynasty might fall, and that Hong Xiuquan's heavenly kingdom might rise in its place as the ruler of China. This was no longer a rebellion in the corner of an empire. This was a rival empire, with its own king, its own religion, its own capital, and its own vision of what China should become. And that vision, inside the walls of the heavenly capital, was one of the most radical experiments the world had ever seen. The heavenly kingdom set out to remake human society from the ground up. Much of its program was startlingly strict, and in some ways startlingly modern. Opium was banned, and so were alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. Prostitution was outlawed, and in a land where the crippling practice of binding women's feet had been common for centuries, the Taiping banned it outright. Their idea of property was radical too. In principle, all land and goods belonged to God and were to be shared. Grain and money were to be gathered into communal treasuries and given out according to need. On paper, at least, it was one of the earliest attempts anywhere at an enforced equality of wealth. And everything was wrapped in religion. The Taiping printed their own version of the Bible, kept a Sabbath, and ran their state as a strict theocracy in which Hong's word was treated as the word of God on earth. Even the calendar was rewritten. It was an attempt not only to win a war, but to build an entirely new civilization. Perhaps most striking of all was the place of women. The Taiping preached that men and women were equal before God. Women served in the army, in their own regiments. Women could sit examinations and hold official rank. For its time and place, this was extraordinary. But it was a harsh utopia. The same movement enforced a rigid moral code, at first even separating husbands from wives into segregated camps. Its discipline could be brutal, and its leaders, Hong among them, increasingly lived in luxurious palaces while preaching equality to everyone else. The gap between the dream of the heavenly kingdom and the reality of it was already starting to show, and soon that gap would tear the kingdom apart from the inside, in a single catastrophic act of bloodletting. The heavenly kingdom had a fatal flaw built into its very heart: too many kings. Beneath Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king, stood several other kings, his chief commanders, the men who had led the movement to its victories. The most powerful of them was Xiang Army, the East King. Yang was a brilliant organizer who effectively ran the government and the army. He also claimed a terrifying power, that at times the voice of God spoke directly through him, a claim that let him, in heaven's name, issue commands even to Hong himself. By 1856, Yang's ambition had grown too large. He pressed to be raised to a rank equal to Hong's own, and Hong, sensing the threat, struck first. On his orders, another king fell upon Yang and killed him, and then turned on his followers. What began as one assassination spiraled into a massacre inside the heavenly capital. By the time the killing finally stopped, tens of thousands lay dead, including many of the movement's most capable people. Then the killers themselves were purged. One of the last great commanders, sickened by the slaughter, marched away with his troops and was eventually lost to the cause. The heavenly kingdom survived this, but it was never the same. Its unity was shattered, its best leaders dead or gone. And Hong Xiuquan, shaken, withdrew deeper into his palace and his visions, growing ever more remote from the war being fought in his name. The kingdom had wounded itself almost to death. Now its enemies gathered to finish what it had started. For years, the Qing dynasty had been unable to stop the Taiping because its old imperial armies were corrupt and hollowed out. So the fight passed into new hands. Across the threatened provinces, local Chinese officials, men of the Han majority loyal to the Qing state, began raising their own armies from their home regions. funding and training them personally. The most important was a scholar general named Zheng Guofan, who built a tough, disciplined provincial force known as the Xiang Army. Others, like his protege Li Hongzhang, raised armies of their own. These new armies were something different. Well-led, motivated, and personally loyal to their commanders, rather than to a distant court. Slowly, grindingly, and at enormous cost in lives, they began to turn the tide, retaking city after city from the weakened heavenly kingdom. There was nothing quick about it. The war ground on for more than a decade, province by province, siege by siege. Zheng Guofan's method was patient and merciless. Surround a Taiping city, cut it off completely, and starve it toward collapse before storming it. It is worth pausing on the human cost of that reconquest. This was not a clean war. Both sides committed terrible massacres. Cities that resisted were put to the sword. Famine followed the armies everywhere they went. In fact, much of the staggering death toll of the Taiping War came not from battle at all, but from the starvation and disease that spread as the richest regions of China were turned into wastelands. And as the Qing tightened their grip, a new set of players entered the war, from the other side of the world. At first, the Western powers in China had watched the Taiping with cautious curiosity. A Chinese movement that spoke of God and Jesus and that opposed the Qing who had humiliated them might even, some thought, turn out to be a natural ally. That did not last. The more the Westerners learned about the heavenly kingdom, the less they liked it. And above all, the Taiping threatened the thing the foreign powers cared about most: trade, centered on the great port of Shanghai. When Taiping armies moved against Shanghai, the calculation was made. The foreigners would help the Qing. Out of this came one of the strangest forces of the war, a Western-trained, Western-led mercenary army fighting for the Chinese emperor. It became known as the ever-victorious army. It was led first by an American adventurer named Frederick Townsend Ward, and later by a British officer, Charles Gordon, who would become famous around the world. Armed with modern Western weapons, this force helped the Qing defend Shanghai and claw back the surrounding region. Gordon would go on to become one of the most celebrated soldiers of the British Empire, and, decades later, would die famously at Khartoum. But it was here, in the rice fields and canals around Shanghai, that he first made his name, fighting a Chinese holy kingdom on behalf of a Chinese emperor. It was a bitter irony. A movement that had risen partly out of Christian ideas was now being crushed, in part, by Christian nations, who chose their trade over any shared faith. By the early 1860s, the heavenly kingdom was shrinking, surrounded, and starving, and the end was coming to the heavenly capital. By 1862, Zheng Guofan's armies had closed a ring around Nanjing, the heavenly capital, and begun a long, strangling siege. Inside the city, the situation grew desperate. Food ran out, and at the center of it all, Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king, the self-declared younger brother of Jesus, withdrew almost entirely from the world. He refused every plea to flee. As famine set in, he is said to have told his starving followers to eat manna from the ground, and to have eaten wild plants himself. In June of 1864, with the enemy closing in, Hong Xiuquan died. Exactly how is still debated. Most accounts say he fell ill and died, weakened by sickness and by the wild vegetation he had been eating. Some say he took his own life. Others whispered of poison. What is certain is that the man whose vision had begun it all did not live to see the end. Before he died, he named his 15-year-old son to succeed him. A few weeks later, the Qing armies broke into Nanjing. What followed was one of the most horrific massacres of an already horrific war. The heavenly capital was given over to slaughter, and the heavenly kingdom, after 14 years, came to a bloody end. The dream that had begun in a fever, in the mind of a failed scholar, was finally over. And what it left behind was almost beyond counting. When the accounting was finally attempted, the numbers defied belief. Modern historians estimate that the Taiping War killed at least 20 million people, and possibly many more, across some of the most populous provinces on Earth. It was, quite possibly, the deadliest civil war in all of human history, and among the deadliest conflicts of any kind. And yet, beyond China, it slipped almost entirely out of the world's memory. It happened far away, in a country most of the West barely understood, at a time when Europe and America were absorbed in their own dramas. A catastrophe that consumed tens of millions of lives became, for much of the world, a footnote. Set it beside the wars the world remembers endlessly, and the silence around the Taiping becomes almost eerie. More people may have died here than in any other war of the entire 19th century, anywhere on Earth. But its consequences did not stay buried. The rebellion had shaken the Qing dynasty to its foundations. Real power had shifted to the Han regional leaders and their armies, and the old order never fully recovered. Within about 50 years, the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in China's long history, would collapse completely, and later generations of Chinese revolutionaries, including those who would remake China in the 20th century, would look back at the Taiping, the failed schoolteacher and his kingdom of heaven, as a kind of forerunner. It began with one man, one fever, and one book he read into a revelation. It ended with a generation in the ground. Perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of the Taiping, that the largest catastrophes are not always the ones the world remembers, and that the whole course of history can turn on what happens inside the mind of a single, wounded human being.